So at Eidos, we call these events connecting conversations because we think in order to achieve the best health outcomes for the LGBTQ+ community, it involves lots of different people from different backgrounds, different disciplines working together towards a common goal. And today, the topic that brings us together is LGBTQ+ youth and the power of belonging, to hear a little bit from folks of different backgrounds, different disciplines, different work about how we can be doing this. Now, the reason we do this is this man you see here. Here's our founding director, Dr. Jose Bauermeister. And it was really his vision to see that there's no lack of great work being done to support the LGBTQ+ community. Lots of folks in lots of different rooms across the country, across the world are doing this. But too often, our work can be siloed. We don't know about the great work being done in other aspects of our web. And so it's important for us to create moments like this, these connecting conversations, for us to talk and just hear how different issues are showing up for different folks. Now, we call this connection the Eidosian web, and you see it here. And really, at Eidos, we don't believe that anyone has a monopoly on good idea or good work. All right, there are folks in the policy realm doing amazing research, community activists, researchers, government-sponsored projects, frontline health workers, and yes, even the business community, all creating important, vital, life-saving offerings for LGBTQ folks. And if we can work together, we can create bigger effects. We can scale our solutions, make them bigger. Because we know this is big work, all right? Even if you look at sort of the LGBTQ population in the US in the smallest terms, 7.2%, right? That is that's millions of people with huge needs. And if you also understand that each generation that has had the opportunity to come out in a safe environment has had more people coming out, we see this as a growing need that must be addressed. Because as this population is growing, there's lots of evidence to suggest that their health needs are not being met. And again, there's different ways of looking at this. There's, do you know that you have providers you can go to who can competently treat you? Are the services you're looking for being offered by people across the country? Do you have equal access in cities and rural settings? Will people treat you right when you get to that medical appointment? And yes, we see this even in the issue that brings us together today. We know from lots of different studies that LGBTQ+ folks have higher rates of loneliness and social isolation, and that these have big effects on health. So before we get started with our panel conversation, I just want to talk a little bit with that and share some of the current research being done, which our panelists will do a great job of problematizing and questioning and interrogating for your entertainment and education. But just some things to talk about. First, I want to mention some key terms. Loneliness and belonging are two things we'll hear a lot today. And I think it can be strange hearing about these in a research context because they feel so subjective, right? You can be alone, but not necessarily feel lonely. And you can have relatively few connections, but still feel that sense of belonging. But the thing is, whether you experience these things personally, whether you hear about them from other folks, having these feelings does have an impact on your health. And there are ways that they can be quantified. So for example, two of the ways that some of the researchers have looked at these are social isolation. So you could always count the relationships that people have, how often they see those folks, how long time they spend with them. That's a way of measuring social isolation. And then you can also look across a broad continuum, whether a person has a workplace, a family, a spiritual practice, a physical practice that brings them in contact with others. Having these strong relationships, we know, has a positive effect. And if you get to this sense of belonging, really can improve your health. Now, the person who's kind of sounded the alarm on this as a major challenge was the Surgeon General of the United States of America, who earlier this year published this study, Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation. Now, if you've been feeling these feelings kind of acutely lately after the pandemic, there are many more like you. But what this report says is this has actually been a decades-long trend. And just looking at one data point, comparing American activity from 2003 to 2020, people on average spent less time with family, less time with friends, and less time at social engagements. Again, increasing this feeling of loneliness and isolation and this lack of belonging. And it does affect your health. So there's many different ways to measure this. The one that I kind of find the most interesting is to hear that loneliness can have as much of a risk of health for premature death as smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. And as someone who was raised with lots of anti-smoking messaging with health class about it, who really felt this was this national trend to sound the alarm on smoking, to understand that loneliness can have a similar effect, that we're not giving it the same amount of airtime for discussion, is a really important call that we need to be giving our attention to this. Now, how does this show up for the LGBTQ community? Well, this is just results from one study, but it does show that even though LGBTQ folks are more likely to experience loneliness, there is protective power in community involvement. So the sense of belonging can actually help you. So just as an example from one study, they found that LGBTQ people from different countries and different age groups, if they were involved in the LGBTQ community, it actually decreased their feelings of loneliness, even though it also increased their sense of marginalization. They were aware of some of the ways that they weren't being served by their societies and people around them, but they weren't lonely because of it. Similarly, looking at drivers of loneliness, even though LGBTQ folks had more stigma, preoccupation, and social inhibition, if they were involved in the LGBTQ plus community, they felt less social anxiety and less loneliness. Now, for youth, I think the places we'd probably expect them to really feel this sense of belonging would be typically at home, at school, and hopefully online. But what the research shows is that we can't take that for granted for our LGBTQ plus youth, that there are challenges that they face in housing, in the school system, and online that others don't, that put them at higher risk. But thankfully, what we also know is the power of belonging still supports them. Similarly, from that first study, we know that if we can give kids access to safe places to make connections, whether it be in school or at home, if we can create connections through social media, that there are these protective powers, right? Less risk of suicidality, self-harm, anxiety, depression. And so belonging, as simple as it might seem, can actually have a big effect on the youth and LGBTQ youth around us. So I just wanted to give those comments to kind of orient us. I will be sharing this deck afterwards, so you will have access to all of this later, as well as a recording of the conversation we're about to come to. But let me introduce the people you'll be hearing from today. So our moderator today is Jessica Halem, the Senior Director of Eidos LGBTQ Health Initiative. She has a bunch of interesting questions curated to have this conversation going, all right? We also have Dr. Desmond Patton from the University of Pennsylvania. He's the founder and director of Hopelab. Hopelab examines how to support youth of color in navigating grief and violence in social media environments and researching innovative methods to promote joy and healing in digital contexts. We also have Josh Lavra, a creative lead at Hopelab. Hopelab is a social innovation lab and impact investor at the intersection of tech and youth mental health. Through social impact investment, hands-on design and research support for digital innovation, and translational science partnerships, Hopelab is helping to shape a future where young people can thrive. And last, but in no way least, we have Jasper Liem, the executive director of the Addicts Center here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The Addicts mission is to create opportunities for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning youth to develop into healthy, independent, civic-minded adults within a safe and supportive community and to promote the acceptance of the LGBT youth in society. So with that, I'm going to hand things off to Jessica. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so you can see our lovely presenters. I'll stick around to help in the chat if I'm needed, but for now, I'm going to leave things in Jessica's capable hands.
Oh, Kevin, as always, such a pleasure to get to hear from you and hear you put so much love into those slides. And I am so lucky that I get to work with you every day. I was really feeling it. Kevin and I get to sit across from each other at work, and it's a real pleasure. So thank you, Kevin. Thank you for sharing those slides. Thank you, panelists. Let's dive in. Let me give an overview. If you haven't joined one of our Connecting Conversations before, this is Kevin's brainchild. And one of our goals for these is to really give more nuance, more layers to these conversations. We came out of the pandemic and we all wanted a different kind of webinar. So Our goal here is we've brought together 3 folks that we happen to know are swimming in the same water towards the same goals, doing it in different sectors, different industries. And we really want to be able to, get each of you in conversation with each other, sharing your work, and also with this incredibly rich audience we've got today from all over the US, doing all sorts of interesting work. It's great to see lots of new and old friends in the chat. So I'm going to ask for each of you to introduce you. We've already done a little bit of an intro, but I'd love for you to dig into your work specifically from this perspective. Again, we are tackling the issue of belonging all year long. So tell me about this, the conversation of loneliness, belonging, community, anything we sort of heard Kevin talking about in the work that you do. And then I told our panelists, Jasper, you inspired me, so I'm going to ask you to go first. Maybe you'll talk a little bit about yourself in a personal way, whatever you'd love to share, about maybe who you were at a younger age. We're going to talk about youth all day long. We don't have any youth on the panel today, but we were all once youth. So let's invite our younger selves to the panel as well. Jasper, I'm going to ask you to start us off with this.
Sure. Hi, everyone. And I guess good afternoon now. Yeah, it's one of the things that's so unique. So at the Attic, we have a brick and mortar here in Center City, Philadelphia at 16th and Spruce. And I see some folks in the participants list that are very familiar with the Attic. So hi, it's good to see your names. One of the things that's so rewarding about doing youth work is getting to see folks at this pivotal time in their lives, but also because, at the Attic, we age out at 24. So sometimes we don't get to see the full impact until I run into somebody later and they're like, oh yeah, I used to go to the Attic, or I'm an alumni. And I'm like, wow, so sometimes the work we don't get to see the fruits of our labors in a lot of ways. And one way I sort of reframe that for myself is I think about, good Lord, when I was in my teens and 20s, I was a hot mess. For folks who don't know, I'm a person of trans experience. So I was assigned female at birth. At the Attic, we start at 14. So I was a freshman in high school. I thought I was maybe quote unquote not straight. I was geared towards being a classical violinist. Talk about social isolation. I spent, 4 to 6 hours every day after school alone in a room practicing. And I was severely depressed. I had no idea why. And it's not until later in high school when we started a GSA, when I got to college and really started to find those social supports outside of classical music, that I really, my mental health started to make more sense. And then, later in my 20s, I came out as trans, I started my medical transition, and all of those pieces, probably all of those steps would have been less rocky if I had had a lot more peers in my life during that time. So
it's such a great reminder. You just sketched out about I pictured you on these rocks, but sort of walking towards this other place. I love that. And the groups, GSAs, shout out to GSAs. Thank you so much, Jasper. Josh?
Yes, of course. Thanks for having me, and great to see everyone in the chat watching. I use he, they pronouns, Josh at Hopelab. We've been focused a lot on this topic from the very early days of Hopelab, but recently more so have been both on, as Kevin mentioned, on the investing side, but then also the design and development side, thinking about ways that we could work intergenerationally with youth. So Jessica, very, very well read that I'm no longer young. And when we think about our work, we need to involve young people. So that's a core of what we've been doing at Hopelab. All the way from building a free mental health tool, which we worked on with Eidos to test to make sure that it was supported with young people, to now investing in organizations like Lex, which is building community for young queer people and for queer people in general, and Trace, which is an online community for trans and non-binary people to track their transitions. So I think back on our work that we do at Hopelab and how it relates personally to me, and so much of it is about trying to create the support that I didn't have when I was young. mean, I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, a town called Freedom, and didn't have access to elders or anyone really who was living a queer life and wasn't struggling or was thriving. And I think a lot of times in my work, I'm focused on trying to create that for young people and with young people as well.
I love that. And we'll be getting more toward, I want to talk more about co-creation with all of you about how we co-create. Desmond.
Hey everyone, it's good to be here. So I'm Desmond Patton. I am a social worker and professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And I come at this from a slightly different context. I'm a gun violence researcher, and I have been working with intersectional youth that are impacted by gun violence for over a decade now. And one of the things that became abundantly clear as I was pursuing my research earlier on was that social media was a really helpful space for young people of intersectional identities to process grief, to connect with others, to talk through solutions, to just be in the mundane, be silly, be happy, be funny. And I have long felt that our understanding and appreciation of social media has gone completely left towards all the negativity that we all see and observe. But I think that there are a number of young people that have really figured out a way to use it for promotive activities, but also creating thriving and healthy digital communities as well. And it really kind of connects to my own story. I am a elder millennial. I grew up in Gastonia, North Carolina, so another very rural place. And being Black and gay was just not the thing. And when I went to college in the fall of 2000, there were two social media platforms that really helped me to find my community. There was Black Planet and College Club, and I was able to connect and find and build us as a community with other queer people of color across the country. And so without those platforms, I'm not sure I would have come out when I did. So I am grateful for those platforms.
Oh, Desmond, you just got me remembering early days. I am the oldest person on this chat, and I was in AOL chat rooms. I had not thought about my own experience with social media. I had an experience connecting with a friend, and we were reminiscing on early AOL chat rooms back in the day. It was a butch femme chat room, and we both looked at each other, and I said, "Wait a minute, are you?" And anyway, long story short, be careful what you say in the chat rooms. Josh, let's pick up on what Desmond just talked about with social media, and let's dive right into social media. Desmond, I'm so glad that you brought up I think we're really aware of the negative impacts of many different pieces of social media. Let's dive into what's working. Josh, you have been co-creating digital solutions with young people. There's people in this audience that would love to know some of your rules of engagement, the lessons learned, how you go about co-creation with young people and creating great solutions.
Yeah, great question. I mean, when we co-created, truly putting youth like at the center of the work. There were many times in the development of IME, the product Kevin put in the chat as well, where our team of designers and researchers had put together something that we thought would work really well, and then we took it to young people, and they hated it, and that it was such amazing feedback to get. Because we had some hypotheses based on conversations we had with young people about what might work, but once we started getting young people actually designing and creating it is when we had something that was really effective. So that was like core to the work that we've done. I mean, IME is one example of that, but we're constantly exploring ways that we can make sure that youth are having their voice heard. And when I say youth, it's also making sure that we're coming with an intersectional lens as well to make sure that we're covering the diversity of identities that youth share, and making sure that when we're creating something, in this case for the LGBTQ plus community, we're inviting youth from all different identities and backgrounds to participate in creating with us.
Jasper, you are doing both. I know that you are in person with youth. What is this co-creation question like with you in doing work with youth?
Absolutely. I mean, I think what Josh just spoke to is sort of this idea of between being youth informed and being youth led, right? So, similar to how we talk about trauma informed care, youth informed care or services is about, hey, I got some information, maybe I did some focus groups, things like that, and now I'm going to take that and make something out of it. But there's always still this, usually an adult that sort of transforms or interprets that information from the youth. So one of the things that we have, we've had different iterations. We just brought back the Youth Leadership Council here at the Attic. And part of that is that we have a group of youth who, were discussed amongst our larger community of youth, and they were basically voted in to be on this council. And two of them also are representatives on our board of directors. And what that means is that we, as much as legally and responsibly possible, we have youth tell us what we need to have here, right? So youth are telling us, hey, I need to have telehealth more available. Youth are telling us, hey, we really need to have a group around men who have sex with men and women who have sex with women. And I say that in a binary way, but everything we do here is very trans inclusive, so all gender inclusive. It's you are who you are. And I think taking that space of, our youth just revamped our community guidelines because, we had a great set of community guidelines. I never want to get rid of this poster that we have in our community room. But, some of it about like technology doesn't apply the same way that it did, 10 or 15 years ago. And so we're looking at how do youth interact with each other here in the space, but also really hearing like, here's what they need. Here's the concern that came up. And then also, because they had so much say and vote in how our community guidelines are created, we can always bring it back to, okay, as a community largely run by youth, how do we bring any issue back to those guidelines?
For all of you, and Desmond, I think about your work. I'm so thankful for your work on gun violence. What do you think, how would things be better, right? If what you have learned, what you have observed in your research with young people online and violence, what do you think they know that we don't know? I just keep thinking like, what do they know? What are they doing that we don't know?
Well, it's a good question. And I think I want to just take a quick step back, because I think that in order for me to hear and listen to youth in this way, I had to check my own complexities and challenges as a researcher in this space. I think we're all very excited to work with young people. And one of the things I have recognized is that it is not an easy thing to do well. And I've needed to partner with community-based organizations and folks who have direct relationships with young people in order to make sure that I'm checking my ego and the way that I work at the door to really meet young people where they are so that I can fully be a listener. And one of the things that I have learned from that is that young folks are so dynamic, and they have a way of connecting with other young people that is very much connected to the culture and their lived experience. And you can miss that through language or music or memes or emoji. And so one of the things that we've had to do in the lab in order to really do our work well is to work with young people as domain experts, not as participants, but to understand where our expertise ends and where theirs begins, in order to tap into that knowledge base to be able to interpret and understand a variety of dynamics that are happening on social media. And so they get it. They already have the language and the nuances and the context to be able to interpret posts that for me might look or feel aggressive or threatening, but for them, is an example of joy or well-being or grief or loss. And so I think being able to tap into that requires a reflexive process from us as well.
I'd love to add to that too. We've had a chance to work with some youth-led organizations that are like pushing movements, and it's like the log off movement is one that comes to mind right away, where it's like Gen Z age youth that are pushing for smarter usage of social media for their community, for young people. And I mean, I look at, not to throw my parents under the bus, but I look at how their use of social media, and it's so different from mine, and it's so different from Gen Z. So it's really been amazing for us to be able to see and support young people that are doing the work to actually create movements for better social media use.
Jasper, if the young people of the attic were in charge, you know, I mean, how this is such hard work. We've talked about this a lot in our movement for decades. You have a legal responsibility, you have financial responsibility, obviously, but you know, what are some of the challenges, and you know, can you say more about this youth-led effort?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that I should preface this by saying that I've been involved in the attic for a long time, but I came into this executive director role only a year and a half ago. And so I really look at, one of the first things is for me to have as much transparency and open door with, you know, staff and our participants as much as possible. All of our youth know that they can reach me. We actually started using a Discord server as a way to make sure that especially the youth on our leadership council, but any of our youth that come in, have a way to get this information, to chat amongst each other. We have some guidelines around that. Obviously, again, because of legal liability and all those good things, right? So I am very much the person who often says, wow, that's a great idea. I totally want to do that. And here's how we're going to do it in a way that's not going to jeopardize the larger picture of what we do, right? And so I think of it as, it's a dance. You know, I think co-leading is really a more appropriate way to think of it, because yes, the youth are saying, here's what we want, here's what we need. I'll give you a sort of very sort of trite example, is that over the summer, we were trying to figure out like, hey, let's do something fun in the summer, right? And one of the youth was like, let's have a water gun fight at Rittenhouse Square Park. And I was like, I love that idea, and here's why we can't do it, right? Because I know I am not representative of the youth we serve, but you know, good 85+% of them are Black and brown youth who are already, you know, it's Philadelphia, so they are already not the safest outside of our walls, right? And you know, Philly's had a lot of gun violence. I was like, I love this idea, and we cannot do this in the like super affluent park right outside our door. However, here's what we can do, right? Let's do something fun. And so we ended up doing a day trip to Asbury Park. We went to the shore. We chartered a school bus, we had a great time, you know, and so it was a way to sort of meet in the middle. Yes, let's do something that involves a lot of fun. Let's do something that also, you know, I don't want somebody to be mistaken for having, you know, they have a water gun and they're mistaken for having an actual gun, right? And also as a parent, I'm just like, I don't play with guns. So, but that's again an example of me taking my personal beliefs and feelings around guns and saying, okay, yes, let's look at what you want, and let's look at how we can have a lot of fun without it putting us at risk.
What I heard in that was water. I heard the desire for water fun, which is, yeah, important in the summer. I love, so you mentioned transparency, Jasper, and I think that really resonated for us. This loneliness epidemic, you know, one of the first pieces of this is talking about it. So let's talk a little bit, you know, I think I've been really moved by this this call that we have as a staff at Eidos to think about loneliness as a public health issue. I'm curious about I love I feel like transparency makes me feel more safe. And so hence it makes me feel more connected. I love this guiding principle around transparency. I guess, Josh, you know, it's complicated thinking about digital health digital platforms, thinking about you're in philanthropy. So, right. So we're all sort of here. Yeah, you're philanthropy funder, you're in engagement, you do a lot of different things, but putting that on that philanthropy funding hat for a minute. Talk to me about transparency in the clients, the work, the issues. I mean, it's rich, to say the least.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like so Hopelab, we have a group called Hopelab Ventures, which is our investment arm, and we've been able to fund a series of for-profit health-related ventures. If you go to our website, you can see those that are listed there, which is a layer of transparency. We're talking about who we're investing in and who we're working with as an organization. And I think like transparency, at least, and I speak for myself, is communicating trust. It's saying that like we trust you to be able to hold this information, which can at times, outside of the philanthropy and investing side, when you're working in mental health, transparency can be really hard. It can be really complicated. So I think it's important, particularly when working with youth, that we're coming from a place of building trust so that we can have transparency. And I look back at the feedback we get from both the products that we consider funding through our ventures, and then the products that we previously built through our studio team. And the only reason that any of them have worked out is because we've built trust with young people to be clear and transparent with us about their opinions. And I certainly have learned the most when we have those really candid conversations where a young person feels safe enough to say, this doesn't work, this doesn't represent me, or this could cause harm. And I think like the ability to receive that and also to like create space for that is really important.
And I was thinking about how in working with founders and entrepreneurs, that open and honesty, people might not want to talk about what's not working. The transparency and honesty, it only becomes an issue when things aren't working, right? It's one thing if everything's going great and life is good, sure, I'll talk about it all day long. When the rubber really hits the road around this is when things aren't going well and we are having challenges. And so part of my excitement for this confab of different sectors is that we want more of this between each other. Desmond, you work here at the fancy schmancy University of Pennsylvania. What is it like? We have many people I know in the audience who are in an academic setting. What has it been like for you in an academic setting, building that trust and transparency outside of what people might think of as an ivory walls?
I think this is why we have to integrate inclusion with transparency, because at any university, you can get away with doing things incorrectly or not centering the voices of intersectional young people in ways that are ethical and very important. IRBs don't always catch everything, and especially if we're talking about things within a technology or social media environment. And so it's been critical to really not only create your own sets of values that you discuss publicly, but to actually operationalize them in the work that you do day in and day out. And also to be very transparent about the mistakes that you make. So for example, I have been interviewing young Black folks in Harlem for a year about grief and gun violence and technology. And I have a white research assistant that would come to the virtual focus groups. They would never be on camera, but their face would be on camera. And the young people said, we feel like we're a part of a white gaze. Who is this random white person that is on Zoom every time we have a focus group? And I was like, oh, wow, like I totally messed this up. And so we had to have a really thoughtful and complicated conversation about why and how, and to also talk with those young people around what the solution would be moving forward. Now, that was quite embarrassing for me, but it was also kind of one of those light bulb moments to really think about the things that don't always feel as obvious in this space as well.
Yeah, and I wonderful, another wonderful faculty member here at Penn in the Q&A. I didn't get to say it as clearly in the beginning. One of the reasons why we are doing this panel without youth in the middle of the day on a Tuesday is because we really wanted to learn how to do this work better when we go back into doing that work. So again, part of us as a sort of think tank was, how can we help folks in the audience who are in philanthropy, in our audience who are in social service work or academia, learn from each other as someone before we go out and work with youth. We need to sort of sometimes work on ourselves. So I want to thank a wonderful faculty member for bringing up the, hey, we'd love to hear from youth. I totally agree. And we love those moments as well. And we found after a lot of webinars, boy, we need to work on ourselves a little bit more on this. So we were trying to get together some folks to help us do better. But in light of that, right? But in light of that sort of this, and I know we're going to come up to our more pointed Q&A time. I wanted to sort of ask folks maybe some final pieces before we move into real Q&A. So we've got lots of different people in the audience today who are thinking about how to do good work with and perhaps for young people in the LGBTQ space, in other spaces of marginalized experiences. What's some advice that you all could share, or maybe some learnings you've learned the hard way? Desmond, you just shared a great one. You know, what are some learnings that you've acquired the hard way that you could share with us as we try to do better work?
So I'll jump in here. I think, I really integrate reflexivity into my everyday. It has become a central practice for the work we do in the Safe Lab, meaning not just raising awareness around social conditions, but actually thinking about my own positionality, my own power, and how I can elevate marginalized voices, support voices, but also step back or step out when needed as well. And what I've learned is that this isn't just, something that you get from a training or something where a guest speaker comes and gives you a 60-minute talk around it. It is a constant everyday practice that becomes a metric for how we check and evaluate how effective we are with working with young people. And it's really been helpful because when we slip outside of that, we can then have a complicated and fruitful conversation on how we come back to center as well.
I love that. One of the questions that came up in the Q&A, I think gets to this really well, Desmond. Thank you for that. And maybe in the chat, you can share if you've got any good journaling exercises, how you do your or anything that you love. We were talking about leaf peeping earlier today. What's some ways that we can self-interrogate a little bit better? Jasper, I'm going to ask you, again, we're in this sort of thinking about advice, learnings, a question in the Q&A about how to really be transparent with youth when you're inviting them into, we've got a lot of academics on the call, into what we call advisory boards or a focus group. Jasper, you're in charge of the young people of Philadelphia. I haven't gotten to say how thankful I am for your work. I know people might just be meeting the addict for the first time through you. How should we be doing this better? You've seen us do it well. You've seen us probably do it badly. You've heard the stories. Help me.
So, I think that, one thing I always think about is that almost by definition in the society we live in, one of the hardest or the most difficult barriers that young people have to get through is adults. And I'm going to say that as someone who's, an adult, who's, well into my 40s and have to constantly remember that I am not coming from the same perspective. To go back to the earlier question, that one of the things is when I think about doing something that's for youth by youth, is that on a panel like this, for example, I am possibly to a fault very protective of the folks that we serve. Partly because that's part of my responsibility, is to create a space that's as safe as I can possibly make, but also because, I think it's different when it's a youth audience or a youth moderator, or if I know all the panelists are youth, because one of the things I see done badly, whether it's in the youth sector or other sort of marginalized communities, is this tokenization that can happen, right? Here's my youth, my poster child, I'm going to put up there as if, like, you know, they speak for all youth, and that's not fair to them either. And so I think of a large part of my job is to say, you know, I'm connected to all of these amazing young folks here. And there are times when, you know, they come along with me to a workshop or a TV spot, whatever it is, you know, and we talk about something collectively. But a large part of my job is to take all of those stories and narratives and sort of create an amalgamized, I don't know if that's the right word, but version of it, right? To help convey a collective experience. And I think that's part of how we get around some of that tokenizing. I'm also, you know, talking about transparency. Like, I absolutely admit all the time, I am a human being. I F up all the time. I'm just really proud that I didn't actually say the F word. You know, things like that. And, you know, I think it's important for young folks to see that adults are also human, right? I think that we grew up in an environment, I'll say I certainly grew up in an environment where grownups were always right? And as a young person, I couldn't possibly know. And what I really want to dismantle is this idea, you know, we, especially in social work, I'm also a social worker, like, or in medical settings, we have this constant trope of like, oh, you're not 25, so your brain isn't done forming. And I think that really minimizes the reality of young people's lives. Because even if, you know, scientifically we know their brain's not done developing or whatever, the reality is that their identity is whole. They are still a whole person. And we need to go back to talking to folks, even little itty bitty kids, as they are whole people who experience a full range of emotions. And I think one of the things that we, as adults, we often have a disservice of limiting because we think that a young person can't do something. And I don't think that's fair to them. So I hope that's helpful. To go about the effective ways to engage individuals, I think about, you know, my job is to say, here is sort of the scope of the project. So when our participants were applying for the Youth Leadership Council, we said, here's the scope. Here's the expectations. You know, please apply if you feel like you can do those. But, you know, if you know that you're going to have a huge life change, or you're not going to be able to make the meetings or whatever it is, then, you know, maybe consider whether this is the right space for you to practice leadership and learn those things, because we have these other opportunities also that don't have the same constraints. And so really looking at, you know, I really take that piece in our mission of like creating opportunities. If I'm not creating them here in our own space, I'm not doing my job.
It sounds like, you know, this building community at all times, Jasper. It sounds like what Desmond described and what you described is even what some of us might, and I'm looking at Ari in the chat, what we might consider the mundane parts of our work are always an opportunity for more collaboration, communication, and community. And that it's funny. I think we used to think in that our professionalization is like, I got to get through these steps to get to the work, right? Oh, I got to talk about all of this or build this, and then we'll get to the work. But what I hear and what you all are describing is the work begins from the beginning, and that community building is in every step. And, you know, people used to, oh, when are we going to get to the point of like, when do we know we've got a community? How do you know it's a community? And I always think about how the building of it was the community, right? That is how it all came to be. So, and that messy part is really helpful. So I feel like both of you have really affirmed this making mistakes with grace, right? We've all moved away from our workshops of tell me how to not mess up pronoun introductions. And now we enjoy the training is more like, I'm going to teach you how to make mistakes around pronouns better. Let's talk about when we make the mistakes. So I love this. One of the things I'm walking away from this talk with is that transparency around process and growth and mistakes and feedback loops is the work with young people as well. Josh, final thoughts before we're going to be moving into our chat, and I'll describe it in a minute, but thoughts around this.
Yeah, many thoughts about this, but I'll try to keep it succinct. I think like particularly to Ari's question in the chat, you know, when we're Hopelab, we do a lot of design research interviews, and we've done like randomized control trials with Eidos. And I think often it can be thought of as just like the moment that you're interacting with youth is like the moment, but there's the before of it, and then there's the after, which is also incredibly important. Like we spend a lot of time thinking about when we talk to youth and we bring them into our work, how do we communicate like what happened with that information that they shared with us, like down the road, so they know that the time that they gave us, and like this, we really believe that they're experts in their experience, and we treat them that way. How would we follow up with them afterwards? And in the process too, like making sure we're compensating every single youth that we're talking to, because they're giving us their time, which is not a renewable resource, is invaluable, and they should be compensated as we would any other expert that we'd want to bring into our work. So I think too, like when we have these conversations with youth, we're always trying to create space where we can help them feel that they're comfortable sharing critical feedback, but at any point they can opt out. So if we're having, like recently have been conducting some design research for Trace, which is again an app for trans and non-binary individuals to track their transitions. And we've been talking to young trans people about the app and their experience with it. And in those conversations can bring up some thoughts that may be unprocessed or not fully developed, or something that might not feel comfortable to share with someone like myself that they've just met on video on Zoom. So we have space for them to opt out of anything that we're discussing. But I think like just holding that space where youth are participating as experts, but then also able to opt out at any point for their needs is important.
And what a great model for the rest of our lives, that, you know, what a great opportunity to get to practice that and do that. I want to describe a little bit what we're going to do in the last 10 minutes. So Kevin's going to drop into the chat. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't Kevin, you do a better job of describing it. I'm going to move to you.
Sure thing. So first off, thank you all for those really insightful words and conversation. I thought it was really interesting. I came away with many more understandings than I thought I would, in different directions of thoughts than I thought I would. So I really appreciate having the three of you speak about this topic. So in any real life meeting, there's a point where it has ended and you rush to the stage to ask your question to the person directly. I'm going to try to replicate that digitally. In just a moment, I'm going to drop out breakout room links in the chat. And if you click in on one of those links, you'll be able to be in a breakout room with one of our three speakers. So it'll be multiple, you know, you can choose whichever one you want. You can go to Desmond or Josh or Jasper's room. We'll have an Eidos moderator there to help you. Now that meeting is going to be like not a webinar, but an actual meeting. So your camera will work, your microphone will work. You can have actually more of an exchange or conversation. So there will be moderators to help you out. So it'll help you unmute your microphone, all that good stuff. So I'm going to put those links in now, and presenters, you are welcome to use these as well. You'll go into a waiting room, and then once the moderator is ready, you'll be admitted to start the conversation. So I'm going to do these one at a time.